All right, so we're talking about definition of wealth is natural products so secured, moved, combined, or altered as to fit them for the satisfaction of human desires. Let me just repeat it. Definition of wealth is natural products so secured, moved, combined, or altered as to fit them for the satisfaction of human desires. And we've said an apple in my hand would be wealth, but an apple on a tree out in nature would not be, unless it was a cultivated orchard. This shirt, wealth, not wealth?
Yes.
Yes, yes. That's easy, because there's a lot of things of the securing, combining, or altering nature that have to be done in order to come up with the shirt. You got to plant the cotton. This is cotton, if the label is to be believed. And you've got to plant the cotton. You've got to cultivate it and grow it. You have to pick it. You have to make it up into thread. You have to make cloth. You have to cut the cloth. You have to design the shirt. You have to sew it together. You have to bring it to one or more warehouses so that it gets to a place where the consumer can get it. So obviously, easy one, that MacBook, wealth, not wealth? I mean, totally wealth, because there's like a gazillion things that have to happen to make a MacBook. My watch, obviously, it's not really exalted wealth, but it's wealth. Yeah, go ahead.
The apple in the wild.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I find it, I look at it, and I pick it off the tree and I eat it, is that wealth?
That's a tough call. Well, you have moved it from the tree to eat it, but you've done very little. I will call that a little tough call for me, but let me say this. We'll get into that in a little bit later, that it doesn't become economically significant to George until exchange is involved. So again, let's go to a Robinson Crusoe situation, or sometimes he'll even talk about Adam and Eve, and they're in a state of nature where the food is just plentiful and they can pluck it off the tree. There's little labor involved. There's little securing, moving, etc. necessary. It's right there. I suppose if they leaned over and they bit it off the tree, I mean, it's there for them to I mean, they have to get there, but of course that's rare in life. But that's kind of a tough case. But another thing we'll get into in a little bit is the importance of the sort of element of exchange of objects of wealth to become significant for the science of political economy. I'm jumping ahead, but I mean, essentially, if you can imagine a world where there was just Robinson Crusoe on his island, there would be no political economy. If you can imagine a world where there are 1,000 islands, each peopled by one person, and they couldn't have any contact with each other, you would have no economy or political economy as such, because political economy has to do with the laws of the production and distribution of wealth in society, in social or civilized life. And you don't have that where there's just one individual. That's not exactly answering your question, but let me continue with this just for a little bit. How about the water in this bottle? Water. Wealth? Yeah, because it had to be, it had to be moved and bottled, and that's, for me to be able to drink it. But how about, let's follow water a little bit more. How about water, cold water in the tap in the kitchen or the bathroom? That's still sort of in the, ready to come out of the tap. Wealth? Not wealth. It comes from, let's say, a reservoir or a water tank. Or to put it this way, water in a water tank, yes.
Well, you have to build the pipe. You take it from there.
Right. So you have the movement. Right. I mean, our planet is mostly, the surface is mostly water, not all of it fresh, not all of it what do they call this, natural spring water. But to get it and store it so that it's available for drinking and that it's pure enough to drinkable, you have to do something. So I would say that would be wealth. But how about land? Is land wealth? Not according to George's definition of wealth, it's not, because land is essentially the reservoir of nature from which wealth is produced. And that's a key distinction that he makes, and a distinction that he points out that many others, Adam Smith and others, don't make that clearly. Sometimes they make it. He's a great admirer, partly, of John Stuart Mill, and also a critic of John Stuart Mill, and he notes that Mill, in some aspects of his writing and thinking, thinks there is a critical qualitative distinction between land and wealth, and in other areas kind of retreats from that. But certainly according to the definition we've given for the moment, I think land, if you define that as kind of the natural world that has not had any of these processes brought to bear on it, would not be considered wealth. I mean, and before we leave this, again, sort of John Stuart Mill kind of thought, what about skill? I get good at playing the piano, which could happen someday. I play it, but is that wealth? Or knowledge or education? The definition again being natural products, so secured, moved, combined, or altered as to fit them for the satisfaction of human desires. Yes?
That wouldn't qualify because it's not material.
He's talking about, say again?
It's not material.
It's not material, yes. Right. So, but I mention that because I think it's John Stuart Mill and some other writers at times when they are defining wealth include what's called human capital.
So what happens if you're a musician and you're learning music and you're playing music and having shows and things? What's that about?
Well, not according to this definition. But here, that's an excellent point, though. So a number of the things that we mentioned, like skill, according to some writers, and like land, according to many writers, and also the public at large and common usage. If I have a valuable piece of land, an undeveloped parking lot in the middle of New York City, everybody would say, in common parlance, that's wealth, and to the extent I have such things, I'm a wealthy man, So George points out that he is using wealth and defining it and he acknowledges this, in a narrower sense of meaning than is sometimes used. And it's interesting because on the one hand, George tries very hard to avoid jargon, the jargon that he criticizes in others, and to use words in as close to their common everyday meaning as possible for clarity. But he will depart from that, and he will usually be good and let you know when he is departing from that, when it's necessary in order for him to convey the concept that he's getting at, because that is his most important goal, is to make clear what ideas and concepts he's talking about. If he can do it without doing any violence to the common language, fine. And this is not that unusual in science either. The scientific or rigorous meaning in a number of fields can have a more specific meaning than we use in casual speech. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you said before that water coming out of a tap is not wealth.
No,
Is wealth.
is wealth,
Okay.
I think. Yes.
And land isn't wealth.
Right.
However, Henry George defines land as any natural resources. So water coming out of a tap will still be natural resource.
Well, let's be clear about this. It's slippery. That's a good point. When George defines land as natural resources, he doesn't mean natural resources in the sense of refined resources. So let me use maybe a slightly easier. Water is so fluid. Let me take something solid, iron ore, okay, as opposed to water. So you have land. You have a patch of land, a patch of ground, an area, and there's iron ore within it. according to George, iron ore in the ground in its natural state, unextracted and unrefined and unmined, is land, because that's a natural resource as land in the sense that he means it. But once you take the iron ore out, you have moved it, and once you smelt it into iron, whatever they have.
Pellets.
What?
They call them pellets.
Pellets, thank you. Okay. Just revealing my ignorance about the production of iron. I did know the word smelt, though, which I think that's valid.
That is the process of making steel.
Yeah, steel. Right. Okay, so, there's furnaces, and you do various things to it chemically, and you heat it, and so on, and you work it up into, what does he call them, pigs of iron, let's say. So that's raw sort of iron bars that can then be used for further refinement to make steel or alloys or what have you, steel razor blades ultimately, or parts. I don't know if there's any iron in there, maybe not, There are many processes of manufacture and refinement that can go on progressively in the bringing of iron to useful forms. So those when those have started, even before they're completed, you have the introduction of wealth. A pig of iron is wealth as far as George is concerned, but ore in the ground is not wealth. So land, according to George, he defines as basically, the material universe, essentially, in the state of nature before man has operated on it. So if you think of natural resources meaning that, then yeah, land is not wealth. But if you think of natural resources, because in the common usage, it floats across different meanings. So if you think of natural resources as, manufactured or partially manufactured parts of land, that starts to be wealth. But in the state of nature, it is not. That's all I'm saying here. Yes?
I just wanted to clarify that because, so land, uncultivated, only Indians have gone across it, is not wealth according
to George. Yes.
But if a farmer comes and he says, oh, that soil's not very good, I'm going to make it a richer soil.
Right.
And that becomes wealth?
Yeah, to the extent that it's been cultivated. But the underlying land, okay, so let me take another example that's analogous to what you're saying and maybe more familiar with us. You have a patch of ground in New York, nothing's been done with it. It's just a bare patch of land. That's not wealth, it's land, according to George. You build a building on it. The building is wealth. You do something to sort of alter the state of the land, the alteration, even if it's in sort of an interim step before people can use it for anything, even the alteration, like you prepare a field, you plow it, getting it ready for planting. The plowed field, the plowing aspect of it is wealth, because you've had an alteration of something from a state of nature. It may not have completed the process where you get one of these guys, but so yeah.
Farmers in the U.S. that own their land,
right?
That's their wealth.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing. In this, I'm not as astute on this as I'd like to be, and it may be covered more in the course that Marty is giving on single tax, maybe, or if I got that.
Doing LBC, non-manufacturing.
Okay, all right, but so you can get into more detail about separating out what is properly considered land from what is considered an improvement. Although a quick aside that I do understand, because I get tax bills on this, because my wife and I own a house. Normally municipal tax bills will assess the value of land, the underlying land, and also the value of the improvements or the house on top of it. Similarly, although it's a little trickier to think about, you can think of a farmed field. in terms of the value of the underlying land, pretending that it didn't have any work on it, and then the value of the improvements on top of it. It's easier conceptually to think of a house sitting on top of a bare space of land to think of the distinction. It's a little trickier for me conceptually to think of a plowed field versus the field without the plowing. Right. Right, but here's the thing, okay? If you buy a patch of land as a farmer or as a developer or anybody, here's an interesting fact that I, get from reading George, which is, let's say, or even let's figure a lot in the suburbs that has a house on it. This actually, this happened to me. I don't know, must be 20 some years ago. I lived in Millburn, New Jersey, and we bought our house. I forget how much we paid, whatever it was. And then sometime after that, New Jersey Transit put in Midtown Direct service, which was much more express from Millburn, New Jersey to Penn Station. And the land values, the value of our property, skyrocketed. It was because that location, the underlying land, was now worth a lot more than it was before. Our house was the same before and after they put in Midtown Direct service. There was no change. So the difference in value, which might have been like $100,000 of appreciation, was strictly due to the fact that now the community, because of the presence of the easier access to the center of population in New York, had basically that created a lot more value. But that was value, sort of market value of the underlying land, which was not wealth. So I'll just leave it there for now, but okay. But the same would be true of a field for a farmer. I mean, the land is worth something based on, the potential for fertility probably, and the location, And if any of those factors should change that have nothing to do with any improvements, they might increase the value of the underlying land. Okay. So back to, so let's pick apart the parts of the definition of wealth, because that'll be important. I mean, next week we'll be getting into the production of wealth, and that, to me, is there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. It's very concrete and sort of brilliant. Today we're doing a fairly general foundation. But, so things that George thinks are involved, aspects of wealth, are worth mentioning. He has a section where he talks about the nature of value, which sort of gets in part, he does this because a lot of writers before him and in his day, economists talked about value as being kind of tied up with the concept of wealth. And, the one source of value is the value of something for a person to use it. You could have what he calls use value, and you could have that in a society of one person. But that's not significant for, as I said before, for political economy. What is significant is something called value in exchange, because then you have a society and a civilization and the interaction of people within it, and that's what is significant as far as political economy is concerned. As a subset of value in exchange, he talks about value from production, which is very involved with wealth. Essentially, that is in its core tied to, all value from exchange is tied to the amount of labor or exertion that having a thing will save you as compared to what you would have, the work you would have to do to make it yourself. That has to do with the concept of value. There is another type of value that he talks about, which is not a species of wealth, which is value from obligation. For example, land ownership, where due to our laws and our social arrangements, if a person owns a piece of land, somebody owns a valuable block or skyscraper in Manhattan, they legally have the ability to extract as much rent as the market will bear from people who want to use that land. But that ability to obligate people to pay that is not wealth. And George, points out that if you were to do away with that obligation or other types of obligation from monopoly or patents, then it wouldn't change the amount of wealth in a society by a single item. It would simply have to do with who has to give articles of wealth to somebody else. Ironically, one point he makes about that is value that comes from obligation can last a lot longer than the value that comes from production, from an article of wealth itself. Because one thing he points out is that any article of wealth, as we've defined it, a natural product that is produced to satisfy human desires, from the minute it is created, these tangible items, it starts going back to the state of nature from whence it came. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly. That apple won't last long as usable for eating. This building will last a long time, but if anybody owns a house or anything, if you don't maintain it, nature will take it back. It may take years, it may take decades, but the natural objects that we work up into the form of wealth in order to satisfy human desires is constantly naturally tending to return back to a state of nature, whereas obligations can last for generations or hundreds of years. If you own a piece of land in Manhattan, you can pass it to your descendants and pass along with it the obligations of other people to pay rent on it. And that's not limited the way value from production is limited. Just kind of an interesting point. The last point I'll mention about wealth, and then we'll sort of get to the close of this, is George sort of considers whether services should be considered a part of wealth or more, well, we've always decided not, but whether services are a natural subject for the science of political economy. And I'm really interested in this because I guess for most of my life, the work that I've done has been providing, I'm a service guy. In my day job, I'm an immigration lawyer. So the service I provide when things are working well is to get people the legal ability to come and live and work in the U.S. That's the service that I provide. When I worked in film and video production, which I did years ago, I would, edit and make video and stuff. Well, I was producing a tangible product there, but some of the things I did were more in the nature of a service. If you do, I guess, camera work, that's a service. If you're, if you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, if you're a musician, an entertainer, you're providing services that directly are geared to satisfying some kind of human desires, but not through the medium of a tangible thing. If I play a violin concerto for a live audience, there really there isn't a natural product there as such. Or if I give advice as a therapist. But those are important for what we think of as an economy. So it's worth just sort of pausing over because this bothered me, over the years. It's like, where are services in George's writing? And they're in there, and he does consider them. But the reason, I'll just read you, the reasons that I put together from this book, that he doesn't think that services as such should be a key thing that is the focus of the science of political economy, although you would think it might. He says one thing is his goal has been to clear up the science as it has existed before him. And service economy wasn't so much considered by the people he's sort of followed. He also says that it pays to limit what the science focuses on rather than having it deal with more or all possible aspects of human interactions and behavior. So he's trying to keep things kind of limited for clarity. He also says that services that you could consider are rarely exchanged directly for other such services. It's possible you could have like a dentist who works on your teeth in return for you singing him a song. But that's rare. I mean, there are instances where you could have that kind of service barter. But normally, George says, far more commonly, services work through tangible wealth or indirectly that way through the medium of exchange, which is money, rather than being directly exchanged for each other. So, therefore, the bottom line is that the dynamics of wealth production and distribution that he does study do end up basically covering the dynamics that deal with services as well. And he does talk about services frequently in his writing. But that's why he doesn't list it in these definitions, because he's just trying to sort of limit what he's dealing with. But I found that interesting because possibly like, anybody, I mean, other than people who produce tangible goods, carpenters and people in construction, to some extent, I guess mechanics. I mean, are mechanics in the service business or are they creating wealth? I mean, it could be a little of both. You're giving me a usable car, but you're not creating the car, but you're putting it in good shape. So I don't know. But the point is that in this city and most of the people I run across, a lot of the people I know are in the providing services to try to make a living. But not to worry. I think George's ideas apply there too. But I'm just, accounting to you for why he doesn't include it in the definition of the science of political economy. So finally, yes, go ahead.
Just because the element of material.
Yeah, I mean, he's doing that in order to limit the field of his inquiry. He does have observations about services, and a lot of the dynamics he talks about and that we'll talk about in the production and distribution of wealth apply to services as well. But it pays, since we're defining wealth and the science, to mention why he doesn't include that as a core thing. Where he, as far as I'm concerned, he might have, but he doesn't. Yes?
So, since he went to the physiocrats and learned that, and the physiocrats used to say, all wealth comes from the earth, from natural resources, so services don't come from natural resources.
Right.
So they can't be regenerated every year. In that sense, I can see why he focuses on...
Well, yeah, I mean, he's basically continuing that trend of thought, but he does recognize, I mean, he made his living as a sailor and then as a printer and a journalist. I mean, journalism is a service thing, and he made a living. He was a pretty thoughtful guy about economic dynamics, so he was certainly aware of the existence and the vital importance to any developed society of almost any degree of services. But conceptually, he doesn't include it in the sort of core discussion of the science, even though it tends to sneak back in repeatedly. So I paused over that. I mean, it's in here, but I noticed it because I'm like, well, what about what I do? Where does that fit in? So it does fit in, but it's just he has chosen to limit his field of vision mostly to the production of tangible objects.
Maybe lawyers aren't that important to George.
Well, lawyers are not important to a lot of people. And I understand why. In a better world, you wouldn't need them. I'm the first to admit. Yes.
2 points about services.
Yes.
Services are a natural byproduct of the process of creating wealth, but services also go back into the process of creating wealth. So,
yeah, so they're very tied together. Yeah. It's hard to separate them. Yes, I agree. I'm perfectly happy to sort of.
Your job involves, services that you do to help to create wealth.
Right.
For yourself and for other people.
And a big motivation for people to get visas is to come here for greater opportunity to, prosper and get wealthier than they might otherwise be able to do. I agree. So it's slippery to me. Okay. So last thing I want to do to close this session out is to sort of probe and sort of consider and experience on a very small scale the moment of philosophical or scientific insight that George had that day in 1870 in the hills outside of San Francisco. Of course, we'll do it on a much more mundane level. First, I want to tell you a little anecdote, and then we'll try just a little exercise. I discovered myself something that you could call kind of scientific many decades ago when I was in law school. I was a law student. I was living in an apartment in Beacon Hill. A completely worthless discovery, but it still had that feeling of a kind of, what's that?
The eureka feeling?
Yes, thank you. That word, the exact word, a eureka moment. Okay, so what it is, I'm in the apartment. I remember this has absolutely nothing to do with anything, but it had this 1960s era, multicolored, horrible shag rug. You don't need to know that, but I want you to know it. Okay, so I'm standing on that rug, and I'm looking at a stereo. Remember stereos? There were stereos, and I had this very bulbous set of headphones that my brother had given me, and they had, you could see they had fairly big speakers in them. And maybe I probably was looking to avoid studying and working, but I was standing there, and it'll take me a moment to explain it, but this hit me in an instant. I looked at that, and I had done film and video production before I went to law school, and I'm looking at this thing, and I'm looking at the stereo, and I'm thinking, well, what's a microphone? Because there was a microphone input in the stereo, and it also had a headphone input, two jacks. What is a microphone? Microphone, you talk into, well, as a matter of fact, I have one here. You talk into a microphone, and the vibrations that the noise that you're making vibrates the air, which vibrates a diaphragm in the microphone, and that vibration, I think, it works through some crystals and some maybe magnetic fields and stuff, but it basically, through the mechanism of the microphone, translates the mechanical motion of the air into a variation in electrical current that runs down a wire and that goes into your stereo. What, I thought to myself in an instant, not necessarily articulating it, but what is a speaker? A speaker takes an electrical current with variations on it that runs through a wire, and it goes to a diaphragm that it causes to vibrate according to the electrical variations in current. So that pushes out air, and it generates the sound that was recorded, perhaps from a microphone. So what is a speaker but a mirror image of a microphone? And here was the moment. I mean, it's completely worthless and completely goofy, but it was that eureka moment still. I said, well, why can't I just I'll plug my speakers into the microphone jack, and I'll talk into it. And I did that, and it was a microphone. It came out of my wall speakers. Okay? Completely worthless, but still, it was like, there was the similarity, or the relevance here was, in the moment where I saw that a microphone, that a speaker could be a microphone if you plugged it into the microphone jack. Before I plugged it in, I had this feeling that it would work. I mean, and then, of course, when it did work, I was inordinately delighted.
I was just going to say,
yes.
Actually, you would think it would work that way because it works the other way around, actually. It works when the...
Yeah. Actually, I thought you were going to say if you plug a microphone, although don't do this. I wouldn't do it with this because I wouldn't want to blow it out. But if you plug a microphone into a speaker jack, you can hear the sound coming out of your microphone for the same reason. Now, I will add as a footnote that I have my cousin Kenny, who studied like audio engineering more rigorously than I ever did. I told him that I had thought of this and done it, and he said that's impossible because like the impedances wouldn't work out. Well, they did, So, all right. But all right. So the last thing I will leave you with. the reason I put this up, so that you all can have a very, kind of low-level experience of that aha moment, if I can also say. If any of you do get the New York Times Sunday magazine, I'm sort of addicted every week to these things called spelling bee puzzles. It's an array of 7 letters, and you basically have to make as many 5 or more letter words as you can using only these drawing only from this pool of letters, and the middle one has to be in every word that you make. And any word that you make that way, you can use letters multiple times to make a word. So bottom would be a word, for example, 2 T's, but it uses. So you get 1 point for every such word, except there is the 3-pointer. Now sometimes there's more than 1 3-pointer. You get 3 points if you can think of any words that use all of the letters. Again, they can use letters more than 1 time, but they can't draw on any letters that are not in here. And if you can find a word, don't say it if you've thought of it, because it may rob other people of their aha moments. But basically, there's at least 1, possibly more, words that you can make that draw on all of these letters. Again, you can use a letter more than once, and if you do that, you get the 3-pointer. The point is, I picked one that I thought wasn't, except for maybe this gentleman, that wasn't too easy. But sometimes it's true. I mean, my wife and I do these, and one person will get it in 2 seconds, and the other it takes us half a day. But when you do get it, it just sort of pops out at you. Now, so the last thing I will say to close the session is, if you believe that George was right in the ideas I've mentioned, and the more detailed ones we'll get into next week, which will be a really good session, the production of wealth, and his brilliant ideas about how cooperation works in society to enhance the production of wealth. Brilliant stuff. If you believe that he was right, then you could feel lucky that he, instead of turning his attention to worthless audio equipment insights or the solving of word puzzles, he was concerned with the poverty problem. And that's where I'll end it. Okay, so. Okay.
What is your name?
Steve Sklar. Okay. Thanks for coming, guys.
Pleasure. Very good.
The pleasure is mine.